The story began when a group of students suddenly found themselves in a strange place during a lunch break. They were thrown into confusion, so a goddess explained that they were in the shrine of Fantasia and had been summoned to save her world from the demon lord. The protagonist, Hansu, was still lost, but excited NPCs, like Hanwoo, asked about typical video game features. Another named Mion asked if there were buff daddies, and Choi asked her if the greatest person among them would be the hero. She said they were all heroes, but everyone's level of power differed. More students had questions, so the goddess patiently answered them until they were all done. Afterward, Hansu raised his hands and said he wanted to be sent back to Earth. The patient goddess pointed out that they could only return after defeating the demon lord. But Hansu was persistent because he wasn't interested in becoming a hero. The goddess didn't understand why Hansu would rather keep living as a dimwit mummy's boy instead of helping to save the world. But he said he was just worried about his family. Before granting his request, she asked the class if anyone else wanted to tow in his footsteps, and when no one else responded, she opened up a portal and told Hansu to get out. As he disappeared into the portal, however, Hansu appeared in a deep, dark forest, not home, as he was promised. Right in front of him was a bunch of werewolves holding a dead elf, so when they spotted him, they were eager to have his meat for lunch. Meanwhile, the other students arrived at the sanctuary city of Prologna and were welcomed by the saintess, Prince Alsus, who was a swordmaster, and the Princess Athena, archmage. Eagerly, Hanwoo accessed his status window and saw 3 titles, namely, Blessing, Curse, and Dividend. He asked the saintess how he could access God's blessings, and she said they'd have to find favor in the eye of the gods, and that each god had weird kinks. One of the heroes asked what would happen if anyone didn't receive the god's blessings, but the saintess smiled wickedly, saying trash heroes weren't her priority. With that, life in the fantasy world had started for the students, while Hansu was barely surviving a hot chase from the monsters. He stopped to catch his breath, but a spear suddenly flew a few inches from his head into the tree's trunk. Back on the run, a status window appeared, and he saw the same headings as everyone else. But his own hero status was under the curse category and ranked E. Unlike what his classmates saw, every experience gained from hunting would be greatly diminished, and it was clear that the goddess really wanted to get rid of him because instead of leveling up, he was leveling to hell. Just then Hansu heard his monster buddies yelling that they wanted to feast on his hot dog. He could understand what they were saying thanks to his curse, which auto-translated the language of hostile races, so he tried reasoning with them. But all his attempts were made useless. Eventually, Hansu's strength had run out, so he surrendered to the fangs of his monster buddies. At the same time, Hansu heard a strange language which became louder as he drew nearer, and an arrow was fired into his thigh by an elf. In no time, a fight broke out between the wolves and fairies, so Hansu snuck out and hid himself away. He was in dire need of help, but decided it was better to die than pray to any god, considering that it was a goddess who landed him in that mess. As he was lamenting, a strange spirit-like being appeared and peeped at him, and Hansu was notified that it was a god. Even though Hansu had initially accepted death, he was already in a state of delirium and asked the god to save him. The god asked him why he was alone, and Hansu was going to tell the god what had happened, but he feared that the god might be besties with the goddess, so he couldn't tell the full story for fear of getting in trouble. All he wanted right now was for the intense, deadly pain to stop already. But the god seemed unwilling to help him, so Hansu wished there was another god to help. But the body language of this current god meeting realized that this god was an outsider. When asked what the meaning of the word outsider was, Hansu lied that it referred to a lone wolf running through the wilderness. The god liked Hansu's definition and even gladly identified as an outsider, so Hansu asked again that the god should save him. But then again the god asked him tons of questions returning to whether Hansen was also an outsider, so he lied that it was so, hence why he was alone in the woods while his classmates were summoned to the temple. The god still hesitated to help, but Hansel eventually convinced him to, so he raised a glowing globe, which sent its powers in all directions and healed Hansu's thighs to the point that he no longer felt the pain. Hansu thanked the god because he suddenly felt lighter. And then the status window showed outsider F as Hansu's acquired blessing. He would be reset from all statuses except death, and if he left the wilderness for any reason, bad things might happen, meaning the god would only help for as long as he remained an outsider. Soon, he was back on the run, but was surprised that he hadn't been caught. and then he remembered the effects of the god's blessing. At that point, he felt his fatigue disappearing with the injuries, and knew that no matter how fast he ran, he'd never get tired, unlike the monsters chasing him. However, they resorted to throwing stones at him, but he somehow escaped and couldn't have felt better all his life, so he thanked God for the amazing feeling he felt in his body because it was his first time. Eventually, he arrived at a cliff and was stuck, and the god told him the height alone was enough to end his life. So he only wished this weekend's selfish god could give him wings instead of predict his death. At long last it seemed like he would end up in the bellies of those hungry beasts after all, and he stood at a crossroads, wondering what decision to take. The result of his contemplation was a proposal that would benefit them all. Noticing that there were lots of hungry mouths, but not enough food, Hansu said that whoever caught him first would get the most delicious parts of his body. The moment the monsters heard this, they lost their composure and rushed for him all at once, grabbing him all at once without even thinking about the consequences of their actions. Before they knew what was going on, their obsession with Hansu's meat caused them all to fall with him, and it was already too late to turn back for most. Seconds later, Hansu opened his eyes and obviously had survived death, while the monsters that fell with him didn't make it. It felt like his body was crushed completely, but somehow he was back on his feet, and the god was impressed with his tenacity. However, he found out that one of them wasn't completely dead and even pointed a knife at him. A status window popped up and Hansu could see that the beast, named Blue Moon Butcher, was at a level 3, and that was probably why it survived the fall, even without having a god's blessing. From his knowledge of games in his past life, Hansu understood that opponents with higher stats were bound to give more rewards when defeated, so he picked a rock, prepared to finish what he started. Far, far away, his own classmates were getting lectured by the Saintess on how they could gain experience by defeating beings with status windows or getting blessings from the gods, but she was so boring that Hanwoo would rather count the grains of sand on a beach than spend one more second with her. The other guy, Choi, was busy praying for a god to bless him because he felt he was the chosen hero, and the Saintess butted into his delusion by telling them that blessings from the gods were not where it ended, but that the gods would always watch over them. Bora asked if this meant to say that the gods would be watching over them all day long, and the Saintess affirmed it. Obviously, what this meant was the students would be rendering free Cornhub services to the gods and hence had zero privacy. Seeing that the class was in uproar, the Saintess told them not to judge the gods with the same standards as crude humans, but the gods themselves behaved like the most cultured men on the planet. Also, Mion added that the gods granted the most blessings to those they found interesting. Right after saying that, Mion won the approval of two gods, the evil god and the wind god, and a magical orb suddenly shone in front of her, as her status got updated to 2 blessings and F ranks respectively. She was overjoyed, but Choi and Hanwoo were both shocked that she was the first to get God's blessings, even though, quite frankly, no one understood how the girl's Barbie world had anything to do with subjugating the Demon Lord. In fact, the room began to smell like fresh strawberries, and suddenly, Mion was the most beautiful thing in the room, all thanks to her charm skill, which caused her body to radiate a charming odor and granted her immense power over Sims. Anyway, the Saintess was obviously jealous that no one was interested in her saggy milk sacks, so she told Mion to stop using the charm skill right away, and the girl teasingly said she didn't know how to get rid of it. Instantly, the system notified them that some virgin goddess wasn't pleased with Mion's flirty behavior, and then the Saintess said it was already too late, telling the distracted Mion to take a second look at her status window. When she checked it, Mion found that she'd been awarded a curse of punishment by the angry goddess. This was shocking and unbelievable to the entire class, because they were heroes after all, but the Saintess enlightened them that the gods awarded not only blessings, but curses, however they deemed it fit. Mion was upset because she hadn't heard about that before now, but the Saintess said she was just about to explain that. Right then, a magical handprint was imprinted onto her, and lightning struck her body, sending painful electrical surges through her body until she screamed in anguish. Apparently, her punishment was that all damage and criticism she received would be greatly increased, and she'd also receive the rod of justice whenever she was being naughty. She then apologized for her mistakes and promised not to repeat them, so the goddess said she'd keep watch over her, while the gods who were initially interested in her had their eyes elsewhere. Unfortunately or fortunately, whenever the heroes received a blessing or a curse, It would never disappear until they died, and the effect would increase as their rank did, and once they ranked up, they would never step down. This meant real pain was awaiting Mion up ahead, because the rank of her curse was an F rank, and it would only get worse. She looked dismayed, but Ethan told her curses could be offset by blessings and the pain would be alleviated once her body and mind became stronger by leveling up. Mion asked her if this was for real, and the princess assured her with the sweetest smile that it was, hence she shouldn't give up. Meanwhile, Hansu was holding a rock covered in blood after he'd just defeated the monsters, but he wondered why there was no change in his level despite defeating tons of them. He suspected the curse might be responsible, but also didn't know if it was the entire leveling up process that was so difficult. He asked the god for any helpful information, but the god said it was a secret that couldn't be disclosed. This was rather frustrating, because outside the god's blessing he got, Hansu never really got much help from this god, and the god was even complaining that it was getting bored just running around. Anyway, Hansu had been running around the forest, but had since not felt thirst, hunger, or even fatigue. But the god still proposed that he do something else. Just then, more monsters sniffed him and were edging nearer to him, so again, he had to get to fighting them. On the other hand, Hansu's flesh-loving buddies were sniffing around for him, so that frustrated his plans of finding a human village were frustrated, as he tried to hide from the beasts. However, he'd gotten a stronger weapon, and also held Blue Moon Butcher's weapon, which looked only good enough for stabbing, but was sharp enough to turn its previous owner into a butcher. As he stepped into their midst, the god feared for his safety and prayed for his soul, but Hansu assured the god that he wouldn't die just yet. He bent forward, cut a rope in two, and wrapped it around the sword, while the god watched him curiously. The other end of the rope was suspending a rock he'd tied up, and the plan was to use a circular motion to generate enough force and strike the beasts. However, maintaining this force soon became taxing for Hansu, and he felt he'd be dragged along by the force and fall after swinging it. But with the god's blessing activated, Hansu suddenly felt his legs stop shaking and his breathing calming down, and then he began to take a swing at the monsters, one after the other. They all felt he'd soon be tired, because they'd already started stoning him right back, and he looked defeated, ready to die. This made them edge closer confidently, but Hansu couldn't believe that they were falling for his petty tricks, and granting him the ability to attack them all at once with his sling. Eventually, the guys were all defeated, and the god was pleased with Hansu's performance, earning him a little more respect from the god. One of the beasts happened to be breathing still, so Hansu asked it to tell him where he could find the humans, and in exchange, he'd let it leave. The beast pointed in a certain location, but Hansu wasn't convinced it was telling the truth, and then he asked it what species of animals it was. Even at the brink of death, the monster still told Hansu to borrow some sense from his dog. Hansu threatened him, and he eventually said he was a gnoll, and then begged Hansu to let him go since he'd answered all his questions. Dumbozo thought he still had a chance, when it was his quickest gateway to heaven. Anyway, the god confirmed that the beast was indeed a gnoll, although it was different from what Hansu was used to in video games. So far, Hansu had gotten rid of several gnolls, but his level was still the same, for reasons unknown to him. Meanwhile, at the temple, the prince informed the other students that training would officially begin the next day, and he'd be teaching them swordsmanship while the princess would teach them magic. He also said they could pick whichever they were interested in learning, but Choi asked if he could learn both, and he was permitted to, although he could give up at any time it became overwhelming. On the other hand, Hanwoo asked if he could altogether skip the lessons because he was uninterested, and the prince told him to do as he deemed fit. Again, Hanwoo asked if this meant he could leave the temple whenever he liked, and again, the prince gave him the go-ahead. Just then, Hanwoo was notified that one of the main gods was interested in him. Back in his room, Hanwoo thought about how training was meant for the NPCs who didn't have awesome cheats like he had, and as the main character he felt he had his own way of doing things. While the others would slave their behinds to get trained, Hanwoo planned to explore ruins and labyrinths, and explore all the baddies in the kingdom. The next day, the prince announced that all who desired to be knights to follow him, but those who wanted to learn magic asked, and were told that the princess had a hangover, but would show up when she was done with her sugar daddy. Meanwhile, Hanwoo checked his status window again, and learned that he had gotten 2 extra blessings, namely Special and Hero, both at F ranks. The special skill meant that Hanwoo was the most special chosen main character, and only he could experience the special blessing. With this, he was pumped and excited, knowing fully well that he was the chosen one, and the chosen hero, while Choi was busy fooling himself thinking he was the main guy, with absolutely no idea that he would only be at best in a rank who'd be the MC's rival. Later, Hanwoo headed to the city plaza, looking to begin his fantasy story. He headed to the guide within and was welcomed by the receptionist, whom he told he wanted to enroll as a mercenary. In his head, Hanwoo was pretty sure this was how the story began for every main character who wanted to skip right into the action. But a redhead told him the guild wasn't made for MC wannabes like him. Otherwise he'd just die like a housefly, same as every other newbie towing the same path. Again, Hanwoo's dumb brain told him that all of this was the effect of his blessing, giving him a main character buff, and that the beautiful nosy lady was certainly a princess or noble of high standing in disguise. He thought it was his fate as a main character and the effect of his special blessing working on the lady. So he told her he wasn't going to return, and that if she was really worried, she could just accompany him, instead of judging him based on his looks. He also said she'd experienced such judgment so many times, and she smiled lightly, saying he got her already. Hanwoo was elated because this really meant he was special in this new world, and so he boldly told the lady that he couldn't say much in detail yet, but he certainly was the chosen one. Dude was all up on his head thinking about how it was impossible for him to talk to such cute girls in his past life, unlike now, where he was a hero saving the world from more dunces like himself. Hearing this fool's thoughts, the system shared that the immature main god was laughing at Hanwoo's incurable stupidity. The cute lady said she was curious about Hanwoo's abilities as the chosen one, and he told her to hold on and see the power of a true Sigma. Back at Hansu's ugly world of monsters, he just defeated another bunch of beasts and learned that the human village wasn't to the west, as the other Knoll claimed, but rather far away from there. Of course, Hansu wasn't going to let him live, and even if he was going to, it was obvious all the Knolls had been lying to him because they had a tell on their sorry faces. Well, at least he knew the human village was actually in the west, and although Hanwoo didn't know the exact distance, he had comforted this by asking a bunch of Knolls. So far, he'd defeated so many Knolls in a really short time, and his battles had turned him from prey to seasoned hunter overnight. As a result, he's sustained tons of serious injuries while learning how to hunt, and his survival thus far was all thanks to his outsider blessing. Hansu was already tired and eager to meet the natives of the fantasy world, so the god equally complained about the distance and apologized for it. Hansu tried to blackmail the god, asking if it wanted him to die, but the good said they didn't care what happened to him. Just then, another beast in the bushes reared its ugly head, and soon, Hansu was surrounded by a number of monsters, yet again. He already knew for a fact that no matter how many of them he defeated, there'd always be more for him to deal with. He ferociously sliced them all at once in a clean swing, but even after defeating the guys, Hansu didn't level up, and it was now a real problem because he'd defeated dozens of beasts that were stronger than him. The system told him that his god was becoming uneasy, but Hansu was soon distracted by the sound of foreigners speaking, obviously a friendly race that Hansu couldn't understand. He suspected it could be the fairies again, but decided to observe the forest, considering how the fairies were down bad on getting rid of him the last time. However, Hansu soon realized that the foreigners were actually humans whom he suspected to be mercenaries, but before his head could process that, they aimed a dart right at his head, although the lucky guy survived it, and they went on to prepare for a full-on attack. Hansu tried saying he was just searching for a village, but they obviously couldn't understand each other, and he decided to put his dagger away in the meantime. He knelt and surrendered to them, showing that he didn't want violence, and this seemed to work, so they lowered their guard. But the conniving, scheming archer soon aimed her arrows right at him, and before he could say much in his defense, it was too late. Somehow, Hansu made it out alive and was now walking with the other humans through the woods. Dudes were conversing in Japanese, so Hansu didn't understand a word as expected, but he occasionally heard them mention his name over and over again, staring at him while they did so. Apparently, he used gestures to tell them his name, but that was as far as any form of communication between them went. He was glad that these ones hadn't fired an arrow at him just yet, unlike those fairies, and he also didn't have to deal with any monsters because, although he couldn't view their status windows, he was pretty confident that they were stronger than him. However, the god pointed out that Hansu wasn't acting like an outsider, and told him to stop acting too friendly with the humans or acting unnecessarily close with them. It was quite ironic to Hansu that even after meeting with humans, he was unable to communicate with them, and still could only talk to the god. But thanks to body language, he was able to find out their names. For instance, he knew the hairy old man was Gary, who was the speculated leader of that party, and who carried an outrageously huge sword like it was a feather. Hansu then began to think and wonder about how strong the old man really was. But the god laughed at him, and Hansu said, obviously, no human could be more powerful than the gods. One of the guys, named Cole, wrapped an arm around Hansu and cracked jokes only the deaf would laugh at. This one had a slender, trim body with a long sword on each waist. There was also Lisa, the party's attacker, who used a huge crossbow made of steel, which Hansu didn't think was primarily created to fight people. She pointed far into the distance, but all Hansu could see was smoke, and if that wasn't a forest fire, it could be coming from the chimneys of people's houses. It felt great for Hansu to find a place where people lived, but it seemed the god wasn't pleased with Hansu because he wasn't behaving like an outsider, and Hansu told the god that he was just pretending to get along so he could get away from the forest. Suddenly, the group encountered a whole lot of beasts, and everyone was positioned for attack, while Hansu just stood aloof, wondering whether the monsters had been waiting in ambush. Anyway, Gary and Cole didn't seem to be bothered much and had their swords flying at the insolent animals in no time. With his slender body, Cole jumped and started clearing the airheads, but they felt he'd soon get tired, so they waited and planned. However, Misa got her crossbow set and began attacking them from a distance, which was a very difficult one for them to handle, given that she was eating them up at a safe distance. She was busy doing her thing when someone alerted her that one of the beasts was standing right behind her, and with no other way out, Hansu had to step in with a face-resetting punch, but the god wasn't comfortable with what he was doing. Hansu, however, begged the god to look over that much, because humans are social beings after all, and he needed their help. But just then, the big monster guy almost squashed his face in his palms, but he got rid of him somehow, and completely took him by surprise, although that didn't stop the beasts from flocking towards Hansu in their numbers. Anyway, he got rid of them somehow, with some help from Cole and Gary. But this wasn't particularly as exciting for those dudes, even though Hansu was grateful to them. He noticed the strangeness, but they spoke to him in a strange language, while Lisa had an arrow pointed at him. Before Hansu could say anything at all, Misa sent the arrow flying right into his chest, and he fell to what should have been his death. As the guys watched Hansu lie lifeless on the ground, they hailed Misa for acting quickly, even though the gnolls had spoiled the original plan. But she said it was all thanks to the gnolls going crazy that they were able to find out how dangerous Hansu was. Prior to that, he looked too scrawny and ugly to be anything but weak, but besides pissing them off with his consistent chatting in that strange language, and worsened it all when he fought better than they expected. Gary said it would have been dangerous if they'd gone with the original plan, which was to sell Hansu off as a slave, but obviously, he won't willingly oblige to that. Gary suggested they grab the dagger Hansu was using, but Cole felt it'll be trash, and Gary said it'd be better for them to get whatever they could off him, since they won't be able to sell Hansu as a slave, not to add that the dagger might be more valuable than was apparent. The other two stared at him like he'd lost his mind, but he said he'd seen royal inscriptions on it earlier, meaning it belonged to the royalty of fairies. They kept going back and forth about the dagger until it was time for them to go. Finally, but Cole suddenly noticed that even at the point of death, Hansu didn't let go of his dagger. Miss screamed at him not to get carried away, because even though she shot Hansu in the chest, she didn't get his heart, and he might still be alive. In that case, Cole lifted his sword to finish the job, but just then, Hansu's status window popped up. Not typically, only two conditions permitted people from looking at another person's status window, which was either someone sharing it with the other, or if another possessed a special blessing that permitted them to look at others' windows. However, the most important condition to be fulfilled for a status window to be visible was that the target had to be alive. At that moment, it was already too late, and Hansu had already stabbed his dagger into Cole's neck, while Misa and Gary watched in shock. When Hansu was done with him, the guy fell dead on the ground, and it seemed he'd awoken Hansu's dark side, meaning this recap just started for real. Anyway, he now looked like a demon to the guys, and Gary was already too tired to fight. So before he even lifted his oversized sword, Hansu had already flown toward him and sent him to the underworld with his dagger. At the same time, another arrow found its way to Hansu's chest, but he cussed out and told her she was gonna know just how juicy his flesh tasted. He approached in slow motion just for the spice, and Miso was already begging for her life in 1,000 tongues. She cried her eyes out, begging that Hansu forgive her, but it was shocking that he could hear her at all, although when he spoke, she couldn't understand a word he was saying. All that didn't mean a thing to Hansu, so he finished her off, and the next scene showed Hansu's clothes on the ground while he put on Misae's clothes, making the god laugh and say they respected his hobby. He claimed it wasn't really a hobby, but just that Misa was the only one whose clothes he could wear among the dangerous trio. He also took her crossbow and realized that he never really knew why the guys attacked him, but at the last second, their status windows appeared and disappeared. Miso was a level 6 with a bullseye's blessing, even though she was not a hero. And this brought to mind the possibility that getting the god's blessing was more common in the fantasy world than Hansu thought. Anyway, the god told him that it was none of his business and asked him where he planned to go next. He said he still wanted to visit the village, and now that he had some money from the loot he got from those traders, he would try to make money do all the talking where he couldn't communicate. Anyway, the god reminded him of what had just happened to him when he tried to escape being an outsider. Back at the castle, the princess had just returned from her daily rounds and apologized for being late, and then said she'd explain magic to them. Just as she started the history, some dude interrupted her and said one could become an archmage simply by applying calculus to magic. More and more losers felt their opinions would change Newton's laws of motion, so Bora told them all to shut the fudge up. This caused yet another argument, so Athena interrupted them, saying she also preferred to skip the history of magic and go straight to talent, but the explanation about the founder of magic was absolutely necessary. She then said that talent was the most important aspect of magic, and what determined that talent was one's natural talent from their bloodline and artificial talent from their educational connections. Athena went on to say that she, being a princess, was covered both ways, since she had both bloodlines and connections, but for those miserable heroes, they had educational connections through him, and they'd all develop high potential from being her disciples. The class rep asked her if it was possible for someone without bloodlines or connection to become a magician, and the princess said it was possible, but Bora felt it didn't really matter since they were all starting with good connections. The princess was initially silent but later squealed in excitement that it was possible, and then she pulled Bora up, saying she'd explain later, and then said that Bora would now be in an apprenticeship with her. Soon, a magical circle enveloped Bora, and Athena acknowledged her as her first apprentice, after which she asked Bora to make an oath. She did, and felt her body was levitating, after which the princess congratulated her on becoming a full-fledged magician. This made Bora shy, with her status window that now displayed her new blessing of C-class magic. Also, the princess mentioned that those who are made apprentices earlier than the others get more talent passed down to them, just like the princess, who got a C-rank talent at first glance. It also seemed like they won't be able to become magicians if they had no parent or master to pass magic down to them, even if they tried. Now that the role of talent in magic was clear, Athena returned to address the story of the founder of magic. This founder later became the god of magic, who left behind a blessing that their descendants and students could easily learn how to use magic. Typically, a magician could use such magic safely and easily, with the help of a blessing known as white magic. To demonstrate this, Athena held raging flames on one palm and purple in the other, and then she raised the purple emblem with one hand, but it gradually burned into her gloves. She addressed that Bora asked if talent was always required for magic, and then explained that her right hand had white magic with her blessing, and her left hand had black magic without her blessing, hence why her hand was consumed by that fire. At this point, a servant came rushing towards the princess and yelled at her for using black magic against the queen's orders. But the poor princess said she was only trying to make the younger ones understand magic better. The lady said she'd report Athena to the queen, but the princess begged her not to, and someone healed her hand using healing magic. All this time, Bora felt bad because it was her question that brought everything about. So Athena said it was all good, as long as she now saw the dangers of black magic. With that, Bora asked what black magic meant and whether it was evil, but the princess said it wasn't just that. Unlike the blessing of magic passed from the gods, black magic was like the magic power of nature. This takes us back into the forest, where Hansu was and had finally found his way to a remote village. At the gate, he exchanged some coins with the guards for some of his morning wood, and he noticed that in the middle of the city, there were lots of armed people, probably because they were surrounded by carnivorous plants. Anyway, he arrived at a signboard the guards had directed him to, and finally took a bath. He was telling the god how easy it was to make friends with people even without communicating, but the god was quite uncomfortable. Hansu asked the god what gender it was, but this caused even more discomfort for the god, and Hansu said he just assumed the god was a guy, for his safety and peace of mind. Just then, he noticed a blood stain that refused to go away, and the god was getting worried, so Hansu asked why. The god refused to expose the reason for its worry, and then Hansu overheard some men heading to the bathroom and led by the mayor. The voice spoke clearly and in a language that Hansu understood, so he dashed to the door and was reminded that his course would make him only understand species that were hostile to him, and certainly that only meant that the person outside belonged to a hostile race, so Hansu had his dagger prepared in case of anything. Knowing the hostile species may be a gnoll or even a demon, Hansu thought twice, unlocked the door, and sat calmly, while permitting the guests to come in. Hansu was really unsure of what to expect, but he knew it didn't matter who it was, because both humans and beasts were dangerous to him. But it turned out to be an old man, who claimed to be the village chief and was only curious to see the traveler who spoke a different language. Hansu wondered if the man was a normal human or just one disguising himself as one, because he looked too young for a chief. It seems the man could see Hansu's status window, and it kinda made Hansu feel uncomfortable, almost like someone was peeking at him in the bathroom. The village chief advised him to hide his status window, although hiding it won't work on people like the village chief, who had been blessed with the ability to view the status windows of others. Hansu expressed his shock at finding out that status windows could be hidden, and the man realized that he must have been so dumb that they chased him away from Earth. He also said he thought Hansu was a bold fairy that had somehow snuck into the village, but it was obvious Hansu had some from a distant place. The story was that his village had a bad history with the fairies, and the gnolls who had lost their homes to the greedy fairies ended up in the human territories. A lot of people lost their homes due to this, and the village was currently a fort made by people who gathered together for revenge. For this reason, there were lots of mercenaries, and there were no longer those who still remembered the grudge from back then. And there were more of greenhorns from the city who came to gain experience. The god was getting frustrated at the fact that Hansu was even entertaining a conversation with this dude, but he didn't stop. The village chief asked one more question, which was that he didn't understand why Hansu was still alive even after consuming dinner that had been spiked with a paralysis potion. Before he could get his answer, Hansu brought out his dagger and aimed for the village chief, but he suddenly stopped a few inches away from the man's neck, and the old man simply smiled. Hansu felt his body getting stuck, and he could no longer move, due to the high resistance potions the village head had devised against the fairies, because their bodies could tolerate potions to an extent. He told Hansu to give up already, and then took the knife away from the boy's hands, saying that Hansu wasn't at fault but was only unlucky. At the same time, the god motioned at the fact that they've been trying to warn him, but it was already too late for the paralyzed fool to undo anything. Later, the man tied Hansu up in an underground prison and told him that the gnolls were victims just like the humans, and the real culprits were the ones who pitted them against each other by taking the gnolls' land. With two other captives hanging from the ceiling, the village head told Hansu to take a look at his status window and see the karma of one who carried the truth. The guy was at an unbelievable level 16, blessed with lunacy and with a fairy as a curse, meaning his life would be shortened, being the sworn enemy of the fairies, and every form of damage incurred upon him by a fairy would be greatly increased. Hansu asked him if the course was the goddess's doing, but he said it was the accumulated grudges of the fairies that had been murdered by him. This made Hansu realize that curses didn't necessarily come from evil goddesses, but from certain conditions. Hansu told the man that he wasn't a fairy, though, and it shouldn't be something to discuss with a random stranger. But the man brought out a dagger to the neck and said he had no intention of talking too much, but changed his mind after seeing Hansu's dagger. He asked where Hansu got it from, and the boy kept quiet for a second, because even if he said he got it from a gnoll he defeated, that would be stupid and would counter his survival plan there. So he said he took the dagger after getting rid of a fairy who fired an arrow at him, and that made them both comrades against a common enemy. The man said he was pretty surprised that Hansu could defeat a royal fairy with his weak skills, so Hansu was surprised that the fairies were royals and apparently didn't know. Now, the man was confused at Hansu's seeming innocence and said he had less reason to want to get rid of Hansu the more he knew him. Hansu asked him to spare him, and the man said it was impossible to do that because Hansu had seen his status window and knew that the man earned his magic without the blessing of a god. Yet, Hansu was still clueless about this, and the man wondered if there was any knowledge at all in his numbskull. But Hansu said it was because he was an outsider, meaning a lone wolf running through the wilderness. The man said it was such a cool word, but that Hansu won't get to wander through the wilderness again. At this point, the god prayed for Hansu's luck in the afterlife, while the poor guy asked the name what his deal was. Next, the man lit some candles with his magic and released a chain, dropping one of his captives onto the floor. He said he was a dark mage, and he needed them to be sacrifices that would prolong his life, because that was the only way he could counter the fairy's curse. Anyway, because Hansu had taken care of a fairy royalty, the village head would make Hansu's death painless, but the boy simply smiled and thanked him for his generosity. Hansu was probably yapping just to stall for time, but when he called upon the chief, the man said he shouldn't even try begging for his life, and Hansu said he certainly wasn't going to try. The old man told him to go ahead, because he'd be happy to hear the final words of an almost dead man. At that point, his other captives were sighing in pain, and he found their cries to be irritating, so he whipped them until there was absolute silence, and Hansu couldn't wait to get whipped while on all fours. When the chief was done, he asked Hansu what it was he wanted to say, and the guy was just silently observing the village chief, wondering why he was acting so strangely and whether his actions were deliberate to show Hansu that he was on the side of justice. Knowing this, Hansu said he understood how difficult life had been for the chief, with no one acknowledging his efforts, and Hansu knew this because he was an outsider. The chief thought for a minute and comforted that if being an outsider was just as Hansu had described it, then it meant he was also an outsider, but obviously dude didn't get the idea. Anyway, that was a plus for Hansu, who was able to successfully empathize with the chief, and their man said he really liked Hansu, but since he was an outsider, he had to keep being a lone wolf. At this point, it was clear this man had a few nuts loose in his head, because he was willing to get rid of Hansu just to keep being a lone wolf, and even God was laughing at his foolishness. The man was truly excited to have found someone who finally understood his mission, so he chose someone else to sacrifice because he looked in the worst state possible. He then dropped the fairy to the ground in the center of his magic circle. He then went on to begin the ritual and cried a prayer out to Mother Earth, and immediately after, the magic circle began glowing, so the chief told the captive to declare that he'd forfeit his remaining lifespan to him. The guy was quiet for a bit, but the chief said he did as he was told. He'd promised to send the captive's mate to the afterlife sooner rather than later. Of course, the guy knew better than to reject the chief's mercy because he'd seen the atrocious acts he committed. The poor guy said what was needed, thereby establishing the pact between them both, and causing some super strange things to happen to the chief, whom Hansu thought would look younger after taking the life of the fairy. When the man was done, Hansu thought the experiment had failed, but he said it was a success, and that he didn't look younger simply because he wasn't human. Apparently, he didn't sacrifice the fairy just to extend his life, and he'd taken countless lives of travelers and fairies in his village, to the extent of making the fairy's curse useless. Back when he was human, as soon as he received the fairy curse, he turned old and sick, but a wandering mage suggested an experiment which was better shown than explained. The man exposed his chest and, to Hansu's utmost shock, revealed the head of a gnoll positioned in the center of his chest, meaning the chief was essentially a gnoll. He was feeling good about this madness, being the combination of two races that held a major grudge against the fairies, and glad that he was going to take revenge with his non-existent intelligence and gnoll physique. Hasten asked him if he'd do all that by himself, and the man said he was more than enough because of his supreme dark magic, and it'll be the ultimate vengeance to hunt fairies with the power of fairies. He held Hansu's shoulder and thanked him for teaching him all about being an outsider, which made him realize his true identity, and he said he'll never forget Hansu and would use his life wisely. Hansu was still surprised at the fact that the chief still wanted to take his life. But the man said the outsider was, and that was the moment of fate. The next scene focuses on the Princess Athena, who was known as the genius of the Archmazing Magic Kingdom, and who admired hardworking people, which probably explained why she took Bora under her wings, even after the girl asked an absurd question in the context of their kingdom's magic. Anyway, she told Bora that her question was awesome, and to improve her now magic, she only needed to follow her parents' magic or her teachers. She also created an ice sculpture from thin air, even though the royal family had mostly inherited fire magic from their ancestors and passed it down through their generations. She was able to do this because ice magic was Athena's unique magic, and she asked them all to try it. Bora tried but failed to do the same thing, but Athena took the blame for this, saying it's because she wasn't a good teacher yet, and after she'd gained more experience, her children would be able to create one easily. Bora thanked her for the explanation, but Mion asked Athena how she'd survive without a magic blessing, and then the other heroes joined in, asking for their own blessings too, and saying Athena should stop having favorites. The princess tried to maintain her cool and did something strange with the ice rabbit, terrifying the students and filling them with dread. However, she just bounced right back to her cute state and asked who she'd pick to be her second apprentice. All the students immediately wanted to be picked, all at once, and with just that one sentence, she made them fight among themselves and turned to leave, after which she asked Bora to call her when they'd decided who to become the second apprentice. Bora, however, asked the princes if she said what she did on purpose, but Athena innocently asked that she meant, and the matter was never really discussed. Anyway, the princess said she'd shown only the ice rabbit and said unique magic can be acquired after countless trials and errors and endless practice. Bora compared this to how black magic could also be obtained, and the princess was shocked, too shocked to speak. Anyway, Athena finally said it was impossible to consistently practice by oneself because it was different from white magic. Speaking of black magic, it was difficult to practice by oneself because it always required a sacrifice, just like Hansu, who was about to become one. The chief asked his dearest comrade to hand over his life to him, and Hansu noted that it was not obvious his consent was more important in the black magic practice, but the chief said even if he physically restrained himself, Hansu still didn't own his consent. Anyway, enough of the chit-chat, said the chief, because it was time to get down to business. Hansu knew he'd die if he did nothing, so he said he had a request to make, which was that before his honorable death, he wanted to see Misa one last time. The chief recognized her instantly and seemed to know her pretty well, so he asked Hansu why he was looking for her, and he said she was the guy behind Misa's sudden glow. The man said that he was just capping because, as the village chief, he knew everything going on in his village and was pretty sure it was Cole who was Misa's lover. Hansu was bummed out because, contrary to what he'd expected, the chief was pretty dedicated to his job, and he had no excuses. But Hansu said Cole was Lisa's ex, and he was the new guy, so the chief asked him for proof. For that, Hansu simply asked him to smell his body, and the man confirmed that Hansu had Lisa's scent on him, and that would only be possible if they were indeed lovers. However, he said it was impossible to grant Hansu's request because Cole and Gary would be suspicious if Misa disappeared. It was both frightening and amazing to Hansu that this chief was willing to let him see Misa one last time in the first place, so he asked the chief that if he survived the ordeal, he should let him go free to be with Misa, even though his lifespan would be very short. The chief agreed and even made a promise to grant Hansu that little, so Hansu said he'd deckled it, and the deal was sealed. So Hansu's body was quickly overtaken by a massive surge of power running through his body, which was so painful to endure, contrary to what the chief said. The old man bade Hansu goodbye and said he'd tell Misa he went to a faraway place, but Hansu said it'd be impossible to do that because it was Misa who left first. Before the chief could ask what Hansu meant by that statement, Hansu had already sent himself loose and made a fist which he sent flying to the chief's jaw, delivered in an uppercut style. As he recovered from the blow, the chief realized that he'd fallen for Hansu's cheap scam, but Hansu felt he could argue that that was his line, because after promising him a painless death, Hansu said that sort of pain would have turned a loyal friend into a sworn enemy. Anyway, the chief asked him how he survived his ritual, but Hansu said he'd tell him after he was dead. Apparently, it was that his magic restriction had worn off because his outsider blessing reset his decreased lifespan. The village chief said Hansu was just a mere rookie who'd narrowly survived, and Hansu reminded him of his promise to let him walk away if he survived. He picked up his dagger and also picked one of the terrified captive fairies. Then he raised his dagger, almost like he was going to stab her, but he was only cutting her loose. The girl spoke some gibberish to him, and he held her by the arm as his witness, but because she was too weak to walk, he picked her up over his shoulder and dashed off with her, while the stunned chief tried stopping him. Obviously, if the chief was keeping to his end of the bargain, then he technically couldn't do anything to Hansu unit he found Misa. But since Misa was dead, there was no hurting Hansu ever. Now the man had this dark look in his eyes and said he could easily nullify his promise immediately after releasing the lifespan he collected from Hansu. And then he gradually released Hansu's lifespan, trapping him with magical twigs and making him realize that the chief wasn't bluffing after all. The man said he was disappointed in his comrade and said he'd best give up on a painless death. But Hansu said it was too early to give up at all, and at that moment, something happened to the chief, who was already choking on his own blood and undergoing some violent changes in his body. His body was failing, growing weak and old, and his strength had left, so Hansu mocked him, and the chief accepted that he certainly couldn't go unscathed even after stealing so many lives. Anyway, he asked Hansu if he was a vampire of some sort with unlimited life subscription, but Hansu simply said he was the apostle to the chief outsider. This made the god somewhat excited, while the chief kept coughing up blood. It suddenly occurred to Hansu that he could finish off the chief and gain a ton of exp for defeating a level 16, but he reminded himself to keep his eyes on the bag and get the heck out of there. However, the chief said he won't forgive Hansu, and that he'd get rid of him for making his dreams fail. The beastly side of him took over, and he charged towards Hansu, clawing directly at Hansu's chest. The chief felt his technique was all that, and even named it Knoll Swordsmanship, something he'd been saving for the fairies he hated so much, but now had to use on Hansu. However, Hansu said it was rather unfortunate for the man, and he'd already healed from the wound, much to the chief's surprise, as it should have ended Hansu's life on the spot. The old man realized that he'd already run out of strength completely, so he took to his heels, but someone caught him by the legs, and he saw that it was the fairy whom Hansu had rescued, and who called him a son of a female dog in her native tongue. Hansu showed up from behind, and the chief kept asking her to let him go, but nothing could save him from the claws of death, and Hansu eventually got him. Also, because the chief had 2 heads, Hansu had to get rid of that, but before anything, the Knoll head started crying and wishing he could avenge his daughter. Hansu told him to rest in pieces and then stabbed him, following which the entire group of elven captives were relieved and set themselves free. Hansu also called the villagers to come see what their righteous chief had been doing to those hot fairies, so everything was just about finishing. But just as Hansu thought it was the end, the villagers started staring at him weirdly, and he suspected that the elves must have said something weird about him. Again, the poor guy had to run for his life and found himself at the edge of a cliff, but obviously had to jump, even as they fired arrows from a distance. On the other side of the Fantasyland, there was a huge fight among students over the apprenticeship issue, but many mages to be masters showed up, and the issue died down because countless mages were after the hero's master title, because of the honor that came with it. As for the princess, she had Bora and 2 other students under her wings, and had begun teaching them how to create magic with visualization, but one of them asked how they could apply math to magic, and she told him to first learn how to count his fingers before asking. She asked if he used arithmetic before creating the fireball, and pointed out that obviously, the reason why they could use magic was because of their master, the princess, who could create fire well. This disappointed the boy, because he so desperately wanted to become an archmage using calculus. But one older guy told the princess that she wasn't right to say math couldn't be applied to magic, because it really could. The man used a fireball to explain this, saying they'd been implementing mathematics to raise the efficiency of magic because, in a war, it'd help one to avoid unnecessarily wasting mental energy. To shoot a fireball far away, one must pay attention to the angle and consider the direction and speed of the wind. Now that he'd demonstrated exactly what the boy was asking about, The old man asked to be a part of their tutorial, and the princess permitted him. Everyone was excited after learning that practical magic was a lot cooler than what they'd been learning from the princess, and that the old man was exceptional. Now guided by excellent masters, the heroes were already grasping the concept of magic, and the gods were all getting excited. Meanwhile, one of the fairies was getting a badge wrapped around her forearm, but she was fussy about it. The girl was Espresso, Eso for short, maid of the fairy princess, and it seemed only a miracle from the saintess could help her recover. But there was no way any of the two saintesses in their world would present a miracle to a mere fairy who wasn't even a royal. Anyway, the other fairy left Eso, saying they'd do all they could to catch a certain human, so she should rest easy. All that happened to the fairies was the village chief's fault, but Eso felt the other villagers who didn't do anything to stop him were equally accomplices. With tears in her eyes, she planned to report the matter to the kingdom when she was interrupted by the reappearance of her friend, who said they'd lost track of the human in question, who was Hansu. Eso asked why they had to care about a bloody human, but her friend reminded her that it was he who saved them from the evil chief after all. Eso was livid, asking what she had to say about the princess's danger that was found on him, and that she shouldn't be deceived by humans because they were beasts. However, the girl said it was still a fact that Hansu saved them, but Eso said that was why she wasn't really telling anyone to get rid of him. However, a new fairy showed up and asked Eso what the heck she was saying, and the lady turned out to be a councilwoman named Celeblis, who was one of the royals. Despite being a royal, however, because she had an infinite lifespan, the evil chief valued her the most, and she was imprisoned in the basement for the longest time. Eso told her not to worry because they'd report everything to the kingdom, but the councilwoman didn't want to hear all that because she was worried about Hansu, who had saved her life. The distrusting Eso said Hansu probably was after Celeblis's infinite lifespan, but the councilwoman told Eso that Hansu used a dark magic pact, particularly a pact violation, and such violations demanded one to repay just as much as was taken. So the chief had underestimated just how many lives Hansu had, and then self-destructed. Celebes took pity on Eso when she remembered just how carefree the girl used to be in the past, so Eso broke down crying because she'd endured so much despair and humiliation, while Celeblis insisted that she had to go find Hansu even in her terrible condition, and warned them not to call her councilwoman because she was easily riled up. The god had been watching them all this while, but slowly left the scene and asked Hansu if he was still alive. But that was just a dumb question because our guy was casually chilling on top of a tree. On the other hand, the prince invited those heroes who wanted to be swordsmen to have tea with him, which was surprising considering that they were supposed to be on the training ground. He later addressed them and gave a toast, but the heroes didn't understand where all that energy was coming from. Anyway, the prince said he was surprised to overhear some of their conversations, which signified that they didn't really understand the true art of swordsman training. So for the sake of demonstration he called the commander of the knights forward to spar with him, and said they'd first show the heroes what generic type of swordsmanship they were expecting. The men began sparring back and forth, and obviously, the guys were hyped just by seeing how good both men were, in addition to the fact that this was the swordsmanship they all knew and respected. Later, both men's swords went flying in the air, demonstrating a sword dance which the prince very much appreciated. But their sparring for the generic style had come to an end, and the prince would show them what real swordsmanship meant. This time, he asked the commander to use all his might, so the guys agreed, and immediately had his sword exuding so much energy. The prince was similarly glowing in his strength, and as both men clashed swords, there was a massive collision of energy radiating so much light, and leading to a broken sword on the general's end, who immediately admitted defeat. The prince commended the man, saying his swordsmanship was greatly improved, but the heroes were so clueless that they didn't get the point. The prince then told them that the whole idea of true swordsmanship was for them to cut through every means of the opponent in one strike, because there was no way they could defeat even the ironclad chivalry with imitative slashes, let alone the Demon King. One of the students rightly understood that this style of swordsmanship was all about efficiency, and the promise agreed with him, after which he ordered them to take a sip of their tea. The moment they all did, it tasted like an old hag's cream pie, but the prince said the tea was necessary to help them all gain her warrior's blessing with which they could all perfect the art of swordsmanship. With no better options, the heroes sipped from their wretched teas, But Choi finished his and even asked for more. He was served more tea and wished he had never asked, although this seemed to be entertaining the gods. Meanwhile, Hansu was still trapped on the tree, and was glad it was even there because there were no beasts to cushion his fall like the last time. Apparently, the villagers had persistently chased him from the village to its exit, and if not for Hansu bribing the guard at the gate, he wouldn't have survived. Anyway, now that he was in a tree, some beasts spotted him and wanted their share of his flesh, so they sweetly told him to come down for a talk, and Hansu immediately jumped down because he'd been itching to ask a question anyway. In a few hits here and there, the beasts lay lifeless on the ground, and Hansu noticed that getting rid of them was way easier than usual. However, his body had become more nimble than before, and he noticed that nothing had changed, except for the usual, which was his dividend points. He asked the god what dividend means, but the god mocked him and simply said the better it was, the higher it was. Anyway, there was a beast still breathing. His Hansu turned to it and said it was something about the fairies, so the gnoll was eager to help because he wanted some of that fairy's protein. What Hansu wanted to ask about was the gnoll's swordsmanship and how it was used. Hansu was currently too weak to make a move and said even if he became a level 2, he'd still struggle to achieve his revenge plan, and it'd be best for him to mimic the swordsmanship that only gnolls could use and maybe become stronger than he currently was. He asked the gnoll how his eyes turned red, and the gnoll said it was the power of the meat, and while he was saying this, all he was thinking of was a fairy with a body that could send a man to hell. Hansu asked him how he could use the power of meat, and asked what it was they actually ate, but there wasn't really much help from the gnoll. With this, Hansu decided to conduct some research on the ecosystem of the gnolls, so he could find something that would aid his ultimate revenge plan. Want to see how Hansu's revenge against the goddess will play out? Or see the look on Hanwoo and Choi's faces when they both learn that they're both NPCs and not heroes in this story? Comment wet fairies in the comment section for a part 2. Leave a thumbs up if you liked the video, and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.